usually the thing that I think that gets an organization askew is you're building upon your past successes.
Right.
Successes can make you lazy, just like cash flow can make you lazy. That's what I think happens a lot of times with organizations. They've had successes and then they add to it and they add more people, and the organization begins to not be as focused as it once was.
Hey folks, this is MK Palmore. Welcome to this iteration of Amplified, the Leadership Student 2.0 podcast. I'm pleased to have in the virtual studio today Matt Chiodi, who's the Chief Trust Officer at Serbi. Matt and I are former colleagues in the industry from our time at Palo Alto Networks. Matt has a very interesting career in sort of the startup community, and I thought it might be interesting to bring Matt in and talk a little bit about leading in the structure of startups, why he gets excited about that, and maybe some of the challenges that you have to overcome when leading in an environment like that. So Matt, welcome to the studio.
Thanks for having me, MK. It's going to be fun.
Awesome. Hey, talk to us a little bit about Serbi. What are you guys doing in the market there? What gap are you covering down on?
So we are in the identity and access management space, and we specifically focus on an area of applications that we call disconnected applications. So when most people think about an enterprise application, they think of, Microsoft 365, a Salesforce, and those fall into the category of a connected app, meaning that you can integrate them with your identity and access management provider, be it a Microsoft Azure AD or an Okta, right? They work from an authentication perspective. You can do single sign-on. You can do automatic user provisioning and deprovisioning. You can enforce MFA. What we focus on are the disconnected apps. These are the apps that you can't manage centrally with an IAM provider or an IGA provider like a Saviynt. That's the space that we're in. And what Serbi does is we act as that middle layer between those disconnected apps and your IDP. So essentially you can extend an Okta-like single sign-on experience to an app that maybe only normally does just username and password. We can also do automated, joiner movers and leavers so that we can completely remove any manual processes in those disconnected apps, and you can just manage it centrally. That's the space that we're in.
Okay, great. How long have you guys been around?
Just over 4 years.
Are you still considered in the startup space, or do you consider yourselves a relatively mature company by time?
Very much still startup. So we are, from a funding perspective, we are what I would call late stage Series A. So that's still early stage. In my view, once you kind of get like B plus, then you're probably no longer early stage startup. But right. I think we're still there. We're close though.
So this is familiar territory for you. You've been a part, I think, of a couple of startups, some very successful in terms of their acquisition or where they ultimately ended up in the industry. I thought it was interesting, one, from a background. If you look at yourself, your background, where your experiences lie, I get the sense that you feel very comfortable in sort of the startup space and environment. And I think that poses for leaders very unique challenges. And that's why I thought it might be interesting to have a conversation with you about, one, your intentional selection of that sort of stage of a company's existence, and why is that aspect of a company stage attractive to you? Let's start there.
It's a really good question. So the first startup I did was Redlock, which was acquired by Palo Alto Networks. And that was late stage Series A. So it's where Serbi is today, I think, probably size wise and whatnot. And I assumed that when I joined my next startup that it'd be very similar. Now, here's the difference. So when I joined Serbi, it was fresh off of the seed round, not C, seed, right? As in a mango seed, right? And what a difference. Oh my goodness. So I didn't know what I didn't know at the time. I assumed maybe to be a little earlier. So radically different for anybody listening, and you're looking at the different stages of a company where they are funding Series A versus Series B versus seed or C, radically different. So I didn't know what I didn't know, but what I found is I spent the first 18 years of my career working essentially for Fortune 500 companies, being a hands-on cybersecurity practitioner. And I enjoyed it. I did. One thing that I didn't enjoy was all the red tape in very large companies. Right. And my wife would tell you that I'd come home constantly complaining, it takes so long to get things done. You have to get so much buy-in, and then even at the end of the day, a lot of times it doesn't happen. And so while I was successful in the Fortune 500 world, I spent a lot of my time frustrated. And it was, probably around 14 years into the work world where I started to work with startups using their tech, using startup cybersecurity technology. And I started spending more time with them. And I was just attracted by the culture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a little bit by the ping pong tables and all that classic culture, like, because, Fortune 500s didn't do that at the time. But it was really just the creativity that I felt from these companies, just when you would bring them a challenge, like, hey, this is the challenge that we have in our business. Product doesn't do it today. The willingness to really understand, like, what does this challenge look like? What does it cost you? And for them to iterate really fast, it just fascinated me.
Yeah.
So, and I would, a quick aside I'll tell you on that note is the one thing that really got me into that, to really go down that route, was actually Sanjay Berry over at Netscope. So when I was at Cognizant, I was one of their first, I won't say how big it was, but it was a very large contract. So I was with their largest customer. And I flew out to the Bay Area to do some things, but also to have lunch with Sanjay. And I was much earlier in my career at the time. And he was just, amazing. We were there for well over an hour. And this was after the deal was signed. So there was nothing he was going to per se gain from it.
Yeah.
And he just spent time. He gave me wisdom, and I've actually remained in touch with him for years since then. So that was a big thing for me, just being like, okay, this is real. Like, there are crappy cultures even in startups for sure.
Right.
But it gave me a taste of what a really healthy, good startup culture looks like. And Netscope is now much larger than they were back then.
Yeah. So you touched on this idea of flexibility, the idea that you can execute quickly on ideas, iterate, likely, as we like to say in our community, right, fail fast and then move on to the things that work. There's clearly a natural tension, I think, that develops as a company grows, right? There's this need to bring on additional people, additional layers and processes in order for the company to operate and function correctly, especially at scale. When you think about a global company and global scale, how do you think, from a leadership standpoint, how are people challenged in terms of the growth of the company, but still maintaining that connectivity to the people?
I think that's hard because, any system that scales, a lot of times, historically through the Industrial Revolution, you've done that primarily through physical labor, through people, right? Human capital. And that is still largely the case, although, I'm sure we'll talk about AI at some point. That is changing for some roles. We're still, first inning of that. But I've seen that tension, right? And as organizations scale, and even at Serbi, as we've scaled from, single digit people through now, somewhere just sub 100, I've seen it as, you add people, and as you add people, you do it for a reason. You need a skill set, but even in other organizations. So I think getting back to your original question, when I look at an organization, and let's call it organizational efficiency, I think as you get larger, what often happens from a leadership perspective is that from a leadership perspective, we're not always communicating what's the most important thing. And that is usually the thing that I think that gets an organization askew, is you're building upon your past successes.
Right.
And successes can make you lazy, just like cash flow can make you lazy, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I think happens a lot of times with organizations. They've had successes, and then they add to it, and they add more people, and the organization begins to maybe not be as focused as it once was. And that culture.
As a leader, how do you keep that messaging alive? How do you even know that you need to keep it alive? Is it just through experience, or do you just, do you start to feel things in the way of lapses in organizational efficiency? I mean, you see maybe teams going askew or not quite focused in on the areas that are really important to the overall organization, and that can happen through a number of issues, especially as the organization grows. Vision is set from the top, and then it trickles down, and the next thing you know, sort of the vision at mid-level in the company isn't quite in alignment with what the executives or C-suite view as the vision of the company. How do you make sure that the message and vision is aligned throughout the entirety? And you're clearly dealing with this now as you guys are growing. Right. At some point, you're going to hit an exponential mark, and the company is going to go from 150 people to say 700 people, and then it's like it's a whole different thing then.
This is something that I've studied for the last decade, just in terms of like what happens to the best companies, what happens to the companies that were good at one time, and the companies that that continue to build and scale over time are companies that are consistently enforcing their culture and values. Enforcing sounds like a strong word, but they're reinforcing it, right?
Right.
They're constantly communicating it. So I remember my first full-time job out of college, I worked for Johnson & Johnson. And I remember as part of that employee onboarding process, J&J is famous for their credo. So a lot of people study it in business school. And I remember studying it when I was in college, and then I went to work for this iconic company, and they took it very seriously. Not only was it on the wall in every building that J&J owned worldwide, but it was something that they trained us on, gave us the history of it. And it really was something that we used, maybe not on a day-to-day basis, but it would come up quite often in meetings when we were making decisions. And so I think there's an example of an iconic company that's been around probably 150 plus years at this point that really has something that gives them a common ground for making decisions. And so for J&J, it's the credo. For Serbi, we have our 5 values. And those are things that we have every 2 weeks, we have an all hands meeting. And in those all hands meetings, it kind of rotates. 1 week we have kind of one agenda, but once a month, we are highlighting one of those 5 values. And it's typically one of the founders talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And usually the format is, hey, here's kind of the history of it. And here's an example of what it looks like. And then we usually give a shout out to 1 or 2 of the employees that's exemplifying that value. So I think there's little things you can do to program that into your culture. But it's easy, especially if you're a founding team member or even a founder, to forget, because you live it. You're the one who created it, and you can assume, well, everybody else must too, right? They must just get it. But you got to remember, you're constantly bringing people are rotating in and out of the org. And if they haven't heard it multiple times, it's really easy to get, that's where that skew starts to happen.
Right. No, and that's a great example that you just showed in terms of how you guys are tackling this issue internally at Serbi. It's I suspect that the founders maybe learned this lesson though from maybe doing it wrong someplace else. Would you think that'd be a fair assumption?
I actually don't know, but I know that it's the values are, and I would also say this too, they shouldn't be seen as something that's static, right? So we've got our mission statement, vision statement, our values, and we've tweaked the values, right? Because there's been, I remember at one of our offsites a couple of years ago, we were talking about it, and one of our leaders was like, this one specifically, it kind of is, I'm not sure how to take it. Yeah. And we talked about it for an hour or so, and we revised it just to make sure it was clear, because it was actually leading. It sounded good on paper, but how employees were taking it led them to actually be distracted in doing other things. So
interesting.
They should also be seen, I think, mission, vision, values. They should be things that are, I think, adjusted from time to time.
Yeah, fascinating. Team building, which is a topic that you and I talked about a little bit offline. I think is one of the critical skill sets for any leader in an organization. Talk to us about how you think about team building, even if it's starting from scratch.
I'm a big fan of like personality assessments, testing, things like that. There's profiles like the DISC that have been around for a number of years.
Right.
That's not one I like very much though. I like the Enneagram. There's a couple that have been just really transformational for me over the last decade plus. But I think they are one signal as you're bringing a team together, right? Obviously, there's a lot of things you're looking for. If it's a technical role, there's obviously competency, but I've learned that if you're hiring a technical role, if you're hiring a software engineer and they have to be able to write in Rust or whatever, like you've got to make sure they can write in Rust, right? But I've found is that the cultural component is actually way more important,
right?
Because I can generally train and teach and bring someone up to the level they need to be if they're a programmer, or for that matter, if someone's in marketing operations, right? So I'd say that when I look at like a team structure, I think first and foremost, for anybody you're bringing in, it's only fair to be very clear in terms of what the success criteria is. And I can tell you, I've had so many jobs in my career where there was a job description, you get hired, and then there's never really any formal goals that are given to you. And that would just drive me crazy. And so I remember the first time I worked for a leader that sat down first day work and said, let's figure out these goals. And once we had them in place, it was so refreshing, because I didn't have to ask anymore, am I doing the right thing? Am I focused on the right areas? So I think it starts when you're building a team is obviously understanding the mission of the team. And then from there, as you bring those players on, if you're building a team from scratch, it's making sure that you've got clear objectives and key results at that level of the individual. And then that there's also personality testing that can come in to help you understand just how to best communicate with those team players. So I think there's a couple ways that I look at when I'm building an organization or just adding to an existing team.
Why do you think? First of all, I want to amplify this this point about assessments. I'm a big fan of them too. They are a component of what I've built into the structure at Apogee Global in terms of us providing leadership coaching to folks, because I feel like, even if you don't agree that that a particular assessment is the right one to be utilized, they all, as you indicated, sort of give some level of signal that then provides you with data points from which you can then pivot, at least try to understand, develop some understanding in terms of your own potential blind spots or areas that require improvement, or not even things to improve, just what you know about yourself going into any interaction with a colleague or someone. I mean, it's important to know those things.
100%.
Have you always been a fan of sort of the assessment matrix, or did that come about from you taking them? And the reason I ask this question is because in my case, I take them and I feel like most of the time they're spot on in terms of the information they provide, which just amazes me from a scientific standpoint, how you can write an assessment that just teases out someone's personality.
Yeah, I have a lot of respect for the people that create those, because you're right. Most of the time when I take them, I'm like, yeah, that's me. Like spot on, right?
Right.
But I remember the first time I ever took one was, again, J&J. Like first thing in employee orientation, everyone took the Myers-Briggs.
Right.
And that was expensive.
MBTI, yeah.
Yeah, it was really expensive. And I will say that right out of college, I didn't really understand the value of it. I still have it, which is funny. It's now 25 years old. But I will open it up once in a while and be like, this was accurate,
Right.
But I think, to your question, I think I did this one probably more than 10 years ago now. Marcus Buckingham, he was the one that came out with StrengthsFinder back in the day.
Okay.
When he left StrengthsFinder, it got sold, I forget, to somebody else. He started his own company, the Marcus Buckingham Company, which I think also then got acquired subsequently. But anyway, he came out with one that's called Standout. And it's now a couple years old, and I think you can actually do it for free. I recommend it to many people. At the time, I forget how much it was like $100. I took it, and it was really impactful for me because for the first time in my life, the way that it kind of broke down the strengths, right? It said my primary strength was that I was a pioneer, and then it kind of went into that. And the second was the consultant. And I had always played up to that point in my career, the consultant, but not the pioneer. And so that you're actually reminding me of this. This was another thing that started pushing me down the path of startups, like, because it said it's like you're comfortable in areas where others are not. Like in terms of like your question, I forget what it said. Like the default question was, "Has this been tried before? If not, great, I want to go there." And that is like so me.
So if you were transported back into the mid 1800s, you would likely be someone out on the frontier.
That's right.
headed west, unsure as to where they're going to stop, but just, hey, there's something out here I need to discover.
New, right? I might die, but hey, at least I'll find out, right?
Right. No, that's super interesting. Wow, and that pioneer thing. I mean, that I think again accents the reason why I thought it would be interesting to have this conversation with you. So assessments, team building. I had an interesting conversation that my listeners will remember with a guest that had to do with the identification. Like, you've hired talent, right? Not everybody works out. There's some misses that happen in terms of building new teams. And this particular guest had a super interesting comment around that. And it was just like, the most time that a leader will waste is the and I can't remember how he phrased it, but the time you determine that person's not going to work out to the time you actually do something about it. And that gap in time where you just leave that person in place can be a potentially damaging thing. So how do you deal with, hey, I made a wrong call on this one and maybe I need to move in another direction?
I've done my share of, poor hiring, and I'm sure I will in the future. There are people who are just exceptionally good at interviewing. They're like professional interviewers. I've had a number of those.
Right.
You're like, this is amazing. And they get through the whole gauntlet of people and everyone's like, yeah, thumbs up, 5 stars. And then, it's like 3 weeks in, you're like, oh my gosh, how did I not see this? Right.
Right.
So that happens, but I think you're right. Like, generally speaking, you're dealing with another human, and there is a part of it now that I feel like there is some time, unless they've done something illegal or egregious or
Yeah,
something
yeah.
like that, right? Where I feel like even at a startup, you do need to. There is some feeling out that you need to do just to understand, like, is this somebody who just is still learning the kind of the culture. And we don't have this at the startup world, right? We don't have $1 billion in our balance sheet, so I can't make this take 6 months, 9 months.
Right.
But there still is, I feel like something. I do feel like there's something as an employer that we owe this person to really try to figure it out and not make an artificial, like, yeah, it's been 2 weeks, not working out, right? I don't know. I don't have like a specific formula, but I do feel like as a leader, you may have to pour a little bit more into that person to really kind of figure out, is this just them learning us, or is this just a bad hire?
Right.
Now, when you've made that decision and you can quantify it, it's still hard. There's no easy way to basically tell somebody like, hey, like, yeah, this is personally about you. Like, it's not working. It's a difficult conversation. I've had to do it many times, and I hate it. I absolutely hate it.
Challenging conversations. They're difficult, and I don't know anyone who enjoys that aspect of the leadership
No,
realm.
my heart rate's up. I'm sweating when I'm doing it. I'm probably more nervous than the other person on the other side.
Right, right. How do you prepare for those conversations?
That's a good one. I always go into those conversations with a script, almost always
Mm-hmm.
prepared. I think that because it is something that is, again, I don't enjoy, I don't want to go in and not have at least data to show like why, right? Because at
Right.
the end of the day, I've never had anybody take me up on it, but typically I will. It's a lot of times it is mostly a one way conversation. They may ask a question or two, but I always tell them like, hey, think about this. If it's somebody that's like, hey, if today's your last day, I'll always put the offer out there. I know this is a lot. If you want to talk about it in a week, I'm happy to have a conversation. Now, I've never had anybody take me up on it.
Yeah.
Actually, one time, I take that back. I had one person who did follow up with me on it, and actually still talk with that person, every couple months. But I think you owe it to somebody who's leaving to be as specific as you can be in terms of why it didn't work. And that obviously shouldn't be the first conversation.
Right.
There should be, you should be having one-on-ones with your direct reports, and it shouldn't be a surprise. It should be really, even in a startup, like you should be doing your one-on-ones, and there should be leading conversations around that. It really shouldn't be a surprise by the time you get to that point.
Yeah. What do you think that observers of you as a leader? How would people describe you as a leader? You think?
Ooh. Well, it's funny you asked that. I just got my performance review today. So
I promise I didn't know that.
I know you didn't know that because I didn't tell you. One of the things I learned. So when I was at Deloitte Consulting, that was actually the longest I've ever worked at one company. It was almost 8 years. It's the longest I've ever worked anywhere. Everywhere else, it's usually 3.5 years, 4 years max. I remember getting feedback early on that you're highly. This is back when I was very, very technical.
Yeah.
You're very technically competent, but a lot of times you make unilateral decisions. People like your peers feel like you make unilateral decisions. You don't pull them in. That is something I've worked on over the years, but I think I still have a little bit of a tendency, especially in the startup world, because you don't have in a small early stage startup, you don't necessarily have 16 layers of approvals, right? So it is easier to do things much more quicker because obviously in the startup world, you need to execute faster because there's always that competitor who's coming up. There's always that newer stage company that was just funded, right?
And, yeah, you got to stay ahead of the bank account, right?
You do. You have to stay ahead of the bank account. And I would say that, I made the comment earlier about the fact that, we don't have $1 billion in our bank account, but any company, even a company that's got, a company that's got 100 billion, certainly they can take their time more than another company, but they still have competitors out there. Jeff Bezos has that famous quote. What is it? Something about your margin is my opportunity. Something like that. He used to say.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I mean, I think that this, going back to the personality tests, this is where I think they're really useful, right? Is they will give you that kind of feedback. Some of these tests will tell you like, hey, here are the blind spots. And I remember this coming up in my standout assessment.
Right.
I remember it coming up in my Enneagram assessment, which was also very fun, very impactful for me. But I think, having worked for some very good leaders, one of my leaders when I was at Palo Alto Networks, Varun Badwar, probably one of the best leaders that I've ever worked for. A great leader will not just say, hey, you're doing a good job. They will also say, here are areas like you're doing a good job here, but here are areas where you could really grow.
Varun's also a startup guy, I might add, right?
He is. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's done it multiple times, been very successful, and he's a rare breed of leader who is incredibly strategic, but can be very, very tactical and very technical at the same time. It's a very rare combination. He's a great leader.
Wow, outstanding skills. So take me into the thought process as you tackle new challenges and sort of something's handed off to you and you realize that as a leader, it's maybe an area that you haven't gone into before or something that you haven't been responsible for, but you are then required to build a team and to execute on some particular domain within a company's operating structure. How do you think about building the team that you're going to need for that assignment?
Yeah, I'm a very data-driven person, and this is something I've done many times over the last couple of years. I've been asked like, hey, can you take this over? I know you haven't done this before. And typically I'm very experiential in terms of how I learn it. So right. For me, the initial part of learning it is very stressful in that I feel like I need to know everything there is to know. So I will read as much as I can. I will go very, very deep into the data. Because the way I at least approach problems is I feel like I cannot lead well if I don't understand it. Now, that's not saying, right? It's not saying I have to know how to do everything, right? If we're talking about, Salesforce or whatever it might be, I don't need to get down in there and know how to program things in Salesforce, but I at least want to understand the problem. I want to understand what are best practices if they already exist, because I figure why reinvent the wheel,
right?
I like to understand, are there benchmarks for this that have been set for a specific industry? That then gives me an idea of targets, KPIs. And this is something, I've done at Serbi. There's certain metrics, for example, in the SaaS field that we look at. Most people are just familiar with ARR, right? Your annual recurring revenue. But there are dozens of other metrics that we also look at in the SaaS space. So I think when I'm looking at that those are things that I start with. My personal method is it can take me, it depends on what it is. It might take me a couple weeks, but I will usually try to become a mini expert on that in as short a period as possible. And I would say that with the advent of generative AI over the last 2 years, that has been a huge boon because I now have the most patient tutor in the world for whatever it is that I'm trying to learn. And it may not always be right, though. That's the other thing.
Hallucinations aside.
They do happen.
They do happen. But I agree with you. I think some of what I've seen and had at my fingertips and been able to utilize really just kind of blows my mind in terms of the ground that you can cover without having to go out and exercise that requirement yourself, right? Like back in, our generation, I think back in the old day, if you wanted to research a topic, where would you start? You'd go to the bookstore and you'd start finding books that you needed to digest and read. And now at your fingertips, you can get a synopsis of all of the various things out in the domain to give you a short list of what that looks like and highlight some of the top insights for you, which again, I just think is going to help us move faster. So you bring up AI. What kind of impact do you think AI is going to have on leaders themselves? How do you think it's going to help us at all, or is it a distraction for leaders? What's the use case for it in leadership?
I think that, I use the various different models from ChatGPT to Claude to Perplexity on a daily basis, much of the day. I've built it into my routines over the last probably 18 months. And for me, it is, again, it's that assistant. It's not the one that's telling me this is ChatGPT is not going to tell me in what direction Serbi should strategically go. If I asked it, it probably would, and it would be absolutely wrong. Right. But what it can do is if I'm saying, hey, I'm thinking about entering this market. I can go to ChatGPT and say, tell me about this market.
Right.
What do the analysts say about this market? What has happened historically in this market? Who has been in this market? That is where, as a leader, you might have had to go and pay a very highly paid consultant to go and do that for you, or maybe get an intern to do it, whatever, right?
Yeah.
But the point is now with multiple different models, DeepSeek being released just this week, right, making all the news. I tried playing with that today. It was absolutely crashed. I couldn't get into it. But with all these different models that are now available to leaders, and I know that even at some of the largest companies, they are now using the enterprise versions, right, with whatever Microsoft has. If you're a Google, and like Gemini, right, is built in now into the Google workspace.
Right.
These models can become that initial sounding board for leaders to try something out and then be able to take it. What I caution leaders against, though, with these is just wholesale relying on these. Like, your brain is still 100% required. They are great for ideating, maybe sparking something you didn't think about before, but we're still nowhere at the place. And I firmly believe that even if people talk about AGI and all that stuff, whenever that happens, I still firmly believe that there will always, as long as humanity exists, there's always going to be a place for leaders, and there's always, and generative AI in any form will likely always be supplemental to that.
Yeah, I try and incorporate that point that you just made in all of my conversations about artificial intelligence. I think it's a tool. I think it's meant to be used as something to amplify, to increase exponentially either your speed, velocity, your ability to get through dense material, all of which still ultimately results in you having to make a decision of some kind after having digested all of the information. And even that, though, I think means that there's a huge upside to using these tools. And like you, I find them to be daily companions for the activities that I engage in, and it definitely helps me move faster through my workday.
I haven't been able to quantify it, but I just know that there are things that I can now do in order of magnitude shorter period of time, just that I couldn't do 18 months ago. Yeah. And so the value's there. And I hope that most people listening are looking for ways that they can use it in their work. But still realizing that, like, there is a value. Like, you can have AI write an email for you, but there's limits to that as well. There's still your voice. And if you're somebody who wants to be an influencer, you're not going to become an influencer by letting an AI model write for you all the time. Yeah. It's not going to work. It can make you get started, and maybe if you say, "Hey, help me create an outline. I want to write a blog on X. Can you help me with an outline?" That might be good,
right? But
don't have it write it for you. It is so generic. I can tell when I see LinkedIn posts that are written by ChatGPT. It is so obvious to me, because there's certain words it just uses over. It's
like in the Matrix, you can see the code, right?
I can see it. I can see it right away, and I'm like, that's not what your normal posts look like. So.
So the name of this podcast is The Leadership Student. It's part of an amplification and belief that I have centrally that people are constantly evolving as leaders, and in fact, not only constantly evolving, there's no end to it. Like there's no destination that you're waiting to arrive at where you get to trade in your experience and say, I'm an expert in leadership. How do you see yourself evolving as a leader, or what do you hope is a part of that evolution in the coming years?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I love to read. I've always, I shouldn't say always. When I was a young kid, I really didn't like reading. But after college, after it got beat into me, I developed a love for reading. Listening to podcasts and whatnot. And I always tell people that if you can get into a routine of reading, especially outside your domain, like the books that I primarily read now are not. In fact, the last time I read a cybersecurity book, it's been a long time. Okay. So I'm primarily reading things that are outside the domain of cybersecurity, and I'm reading things that are historic. I find a lot of very useful things from history that can be applied. I'm like, did people forget this happened? Like, I can apply this and look like a genius to today. So I would say, like, from a leadership perspective, it's the classic, the more I learn, the more I realize how little I know.
Yeah.
It is so true. And if you don't read, you can very easily come to the conclusion that you know everything about a topic.
Right.
And it's
enticing, right?
Yes, it's very enticing just to be like, okay, I've arrived, especially if and I'm not saying it's bad to be at a company for a long time, but if you're at a company, 5, 10 plus years, it is easy to get very comfortable. And I remember I was at that point when I was at Deloitte. I mentioned that I was Deloitte a long time, great company, but I did get stagnant being there that long. And I remember when I first started looking, I was scared. I was like, man, am I still going to be able to do this? Right. So, but yes, I think that I say it all the time on my podcast that leaders are learners. And I think it's important to read widely and really read outside of your core domain that you spend, 40, 50 hours a week on. I think that's really important.
Yeah. Talk to us a little bit about your podcast. What's it named?
So Cloud Security Today, cloudsecuritytoday.com. This was a podcast I started over 4 years ago when I was still at Palo Alto Networks, and cloud was still very nascent back then. And the podcast has evolved a little bit over the last 4 years. It used to be a little bit more technical, kind of into the weeds of, AWS and whatnot, containers and, Lambda functions. And I'd say over the last probably 2.5, 3 years, it does focus more on, we're always talking about some cyber topic, but it's less technical. And now it's much more focused on leadership. So there's a lot more leadership aspects around it. But we usually have, a specific topic of the day. Like I only do it monthly just because I don't have time.
Yeah,
People always ask me, like, why don't you do it weekly? It's good. And I'm like, yeah, why don't you come and produce it for me? So, I mean, MK, right?
Yeah, I know. I limit mine to 2 per month because the first iteration of the Leadership Student, I was doing it whenever people were available to record, and it was daunting to say the least, from a timing standpoint and prep and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I've settled in on 2 recordings per month, and that's all I have the bandwidth for.
Yeah, it's a lot of work, but I enjoy the podcast because I'm learning from my guests all the time. Because I typically will find somebody. Sometimes they're people I worked with in the past, but usually, like, my process is I'm on LinkedIn and I find somebody that's like interesting, and I'm like, this person's interesting. Like, and I look at there and I'm like, oh, here's a topic we haven't covered before. Right. I've got somebody coming on next week from who's been at Sands for a long time, and they're going to talk about building a security, moving from security awareness to a security culture. That's not really a topic I really know very much about. Mm-hmm. So it was great to kind of deep dive into the guest and look at their background, how they came from being a tank commander now to working at Sands for the last 20 plus years. And so I just find people interesting and try to bring them on a podcast and talk to them and have interesting conversation. So,
well, that's awesome, Matt. This conversation has met all of the expectation for me. I appreciate you agreeing to come on, and I think that the audience has probably gotten just teased a bit in terms of your experience base, but I think you totally hit the mark, and I appreciate you coming on.
Awesome, Matt. MK, this has been fun. Glad to be on.
All right, very cool. Where can people find you? Is it okay for folks to reach out to you on LinkedIn? And
100%. Yeah, that's where I do spend. I usually post about 4 times a week.
Okay.
And that is my primary platform. So feel free to reach out to me there.
All right. Outstanding. Matt Chiodi, thanks for being on Amplified, the Leadership Student 2.0 podcast. We'll see you guys next time.
Thank you for listening to Amplified, the Leadership Student 2.0 podcast. If you're ready to elevate your personal leadership and drive your team's success, connect with Apogee Global RMS for custom coaching and development solutions. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode of impactful personal leadership strategies. Until next time, keep leading with purpose and empowering those around you. Together, we'll amplify your success